They mocked her, called her a charity case, a gold digger, just another stranger trying to steal what wasn't hers. They had no idea who she was. But when the lawyer spoke, everything changed. This is the story of the Hammond family fortune, a decades-old secret, and the moment 3 wealthy siblings learned the most expensive lesson of their lives. Quick, before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you love stories about karma, family drama, and jaw-dropping twists, smash that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you do not want to miss what's about to happen. The law offices of Patterson and Associates, 15th floor, downtown Portland, Oregon. Floor-to-ceiling windows, leather chairs, the kind of place where fortunes change hands with the stroke of a pen. Richard Hammond had been dead for exactly 2 weeks. His 3 children had arranged the will reading with almost indecent haste. Victoria Hammond Ashford arrived first. Chanel suit, perfect hair, checking her Rolex. She'd flown in from Manhattan, already calculating her share of the $340 million Hammond Industries empire. Finally, she muttered, settling into the head chair like she owned it. I have a board meeting Thursday. Let's get this over with. Her brother Douglas strolled in, Tesla keys jangling, designer stubble, that carefully crafted rich casual look. At 47, he'd perfected the art of looking busy while doing very little. Vicky, flight okay? Fine. Where's Jeffrey? Late as usual. The youngest sibling, Jeffrey, slouched in 15 minutes behind schedule. Sunglasses indoors. The faint smell of cigarettes. At 42, he was still waiting for life to hand him the success he felt he deserved. 3 sharks, 1 conference table, and a fortune just waiting to be divided. Attorney Margaret Patterson entered at exactly 2 p.m. Steel gray hair, severe expression, the kind of lawyer who'd spent 32 years keeping secrets. Thank you all for coming, she began. Can we just start? Victoria didn't look up from her phone. Some of us have actual responsibilities. Margaret's jaw tightened. Of course. However, we're waiting for one more person. One more. Douglas leaned forward. Who? All parties named in the will must be present. Then they heard it. Slow footsteps in the corridor. The door opened, and an old woman entered. 75, maybe 80. Skin like weathered paper. Hands gnarled with arthritis. Her floral dress looked decades out of style, and she carried a cracked leather purse that had seen better years. But her eyes, bright, alert, dignified, swept the room without fear. She moved slowly to the empty chair at the far end of the table. Victoria's eyebrows rose. I'm sorry, but who are you? The old woman settled into her chair with a quiet grunt. My name is Eleanor Walsh. Walsh? Jeffrey removed his sunglasses. Never heard of you. Ms. Walsh is named in your father's will, Margaret said evenly. She has every right to be here. Douglas laughed, sharp and dismissive. Dad probably left her a few thousand for some charity thing. Can we please get to the actual distribution? Eleanor said nothing, just folded her hands over her purse and waited. Victoria studied her with narrowing eyes. Did you work for my father? No. Then how did you know him? Victoria, please. Margaret opened her folder. All questions will be answered. Now, if we may proceed. Jeffrey leaned toward Douglas, whispering just loud enough. $10 says she's some ex-girlfriend cashing in. Probably been planning this for years. Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes, but her face remained still. Margaret cleared her throat. The last will and testament of Richard Allen Hammond, dated March 15th of this year. March? Victoria interrupted. That was only 6 months ago, right after his diagnosis. A chill settled over the room. Your father revised his will knowing he had less than a year to live, Margaret confirmed. He was of sound mind. This document is legally ironclad. The Hammond siblings exchanged glances. Just read it, Douglas said. But none of them were prepared for what came next. Margaret began with the standard legal language: debts, funeral expenses, executor appointments. The siblings shifted impatiently. Eleanor sat perfectly still. Then Margaret reached the heart of it. To my children, Victoria, Douglas, and Jeffrey, who have never wanted for anything in their lives, I leave the following. Victoria leaned forward. To Victoria, I leave my collection of first edition books, valued at approximately $50,000. You always did prefer appearances to substance. Victoria's face went pale. What? To Douglas, I leave my 1967 Corvette Stingray, valued at approximately $120,000. You've always loved flash over function. Douglas's mouth fell open. To Jeffrey, I leave my Rolex watch collection, valued at approximately $85,000. At least you'll have something to pawn when your next business venture fails. Jeffrey went rigid. That's it. Victoria's voice cracked. Books? He's leaving us books. There's more, Margaret said calmly. The remainder of my estate, including all shares of Hammond Industries, all real estate holdings, all investment portfolios, and all remaining personal property. The room held its breath. I leave in its entirety to Eleanor Walsh. Silence. Then chaos. What? Victoria shot up so fast her chair toppled. This is insane. He wasn't thinking clearly. Douglas slammed the table. He was dying. He was medicated. We'll contest this. Jeffrey was on his feet. This will never hold up. Through it all, Eleanor sat motionless. Instructions. Victoria was shaking. I don't need instructions. I need an explanation for why some random stranger is stealing my inheritance. Your inheritance? Margaret's voice could cut steel. Richard Hammond earned every penny. He had the right to distribute it as he saw fit. We're his children, Douglas roared. And he has not left you destitute. The items total over $250,000. Out of $340 million. Actually, Eleanor spoke for the first time since the reading began, her voice quiet but steady. Richard wanted me to tell you something. All eyes turned to her. She reached into her worn purse with trembling hands and pulled out a photograph. Old, creased, faded colors. She placed it on the table and slid it toward the center. He wanted you to see this. Victoria snatched it first. The blood drained from her face. Douglas leaned over, his expression shifting from rage to confusion. Jeffrey took the photo with shaking hands. A young Richard Hammond, 25, lean, handsome, white button-down and jeans. His arm around a beautiful young black woman with kind eyes and an afro that framed her face like a crown. They stood in front of Hammond's Hardware, the original store in Salem. They looked happy. They looked in love. Who is this? Victoria whispered. Eleanor's voice remained steady. That's me. In 1968. The room went silent. Your father and I met when I was 23, Eleanor began. I just moved to Salem from Mississippi. Got a job as a secretary at a law firm downtown. Richard's hardware store was right next door. She paused, eyes distant with memory. He used to come into the diner where I'd eat breakfast. Every morning. This was 1968. Oregon had only repealed its exclusion laws 15 years earlier. Black people were barely legally allowed to live here. And here was this white man, this business owner, treating me like I mattered. We started talking, just talking at first. He was different from anyone I'd known. Kind, curious. He wanted to build something that mattered. Victoria slowly lowered herself back into her seat. We fell in love. Deeply, completely. For 2 years we were together. We had to hide it. His business was growing, and Salem in 1968 wasn't ready for us. We'd meet in other towns at my apartment after dark. He talked about running away with me, starting over where nobody knew us. She picked up the photograph, running one finger across the faded image. This was taken the day he asked me to marry me. June 3rd, 1969. He'd saved up for a ring, nothing fancy, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. So what happened? Jeffrey asked quietly. Eleanor's expression hardened. His family happened. His parents found out. They told him if he married me, they'd disown him, destroy his business. His father had connections, real connections. He could have done it. She set the photograph down. And Richard had a choice to make. Me or everything he'd been building. Pause. He chose his dream. The words hung in the air like smoke. But he didn't just walk away, Eleanor continued. We talked for hours that night. He cried. I'd never seen a man cry like that. He told me he was a coward, that he'd never forgive himself. I told him I understood. And I did, in a way. I knew what it cost to love someone like me in a world like that. So I let him go. Her hands tightened on her purse. I moved to Portland a month later. Never married. Worked as a nurse for 43 years at Emmanuel Hospital. I had a good life. But I never stopped thinking about him. Why didn't we know about you? Victoria's voice barely a whisper. Because he married your mother 3 years later. Linda was from the right family. She gave him 3 children. He built his empire. He became the Richard Hammond you knew. Margaret spoke up. Richard reached out to Eleanor 5 years ago after your mother passed. They reconnected. He found me through Facebook, Eleanor said with a soft laugh. I couldn't believe it. We started meeting for coffee. Just coffee. We were both old by then, too late for anything else. But we became friends. Real friends. She looked at each sibling in turn. He told me about his life. His regrets. He told me about you 3. The siblings shifted uncomfortably. He told me Victoria hadn't spoken to him except through lawyers since he refused to invest in her hedge fund. Victoria flinched. He told me Douglas only called when he needed money for real estate deals. Douglas looked at the floor. He told me Jeffrey blamed him for every failure and never once asked how he was doing. Jeffrey's eyes went bright with tears. He told me he'd given you everything, the best schools, unlimited money, every opportunity, and somehow raised children who only saw him as a bank account. The words landed like physical blows. When he got sick, I visited him every week, every single week. I held his hand. I read to him. I listened. Your father died with me beside his bed, holding his hand, telling him he was a good man who'd lived a complicated life. None of you were there. We didn't know he was that close. Victoria started. You didn't know because you didn't visit. Eleanor cut her off. In the last 6 weeks of his life, Victoria came twice. Douglas came once. Jeffrey never came at all. Margaret pulled another document from her folder. Richard left a letter. He asked that I read it after Eleanor explained everything. She looked at the siblings. Would you like to hear it? No one spoke. But no one said no. Margaret began to read, and Richard Hammond's voice filled the room from beyond the grave. To my children, if you're hearing this, you've just learned about Eleanor. I can imagine your shock. Your anger. Good. Now you know how I felt watching you these past years. I gave you everything, and in doing so, I gave you nothing. I showered you with money, thinking I was being a good father. But I was really trying to buy absolution for letting Eleanor go. Victoria, you're brilliant, but you've forgotten how to simply live. When did my daughter, who wanted to save whales, become someone who only wanted to be richer than her friends? Victoria's carefully applied mascara began to streak. Douglas, you inherited my business sense but none of my work ethic. You want rewards without sacrifice. Respect without earning it. Douglas's hands clenched into fists. Jeffrey, you've spent your life blaming everyone else. You've never understood that success is about getting up after you fall down and trying again. Jeffrey put his head in his hands. I've left each of you something meaningful, not because you deserve it, but because I hope it makes you think. The books for Victoria because there's more to life than balance sheets. The car for Douglas because I built it with my own hands, and real value comes from creation. The watches for Jeffrey because time is the only thing we can't buy more of, and you've wasted so much of it. My fortune goes to Eleanor, the one person who loved me for who I was, not what I had. She never asked me for anything. When I tried to give her money, she refused. She reconnected with me because she still saw the scared young man who loved her. Margaret's voice caught slightly. I'm leaving her everything because she deserves it. Because she was there when it mattered. Because she showed me more love than my own children ever did. If you contest this will, you'll lose. But more importantly, you'll prove everything I've written is true. I hope this shocks you into becoming better people. I hope you learn that money is just paper, but people are what matter. I loved you all. I just wish you'd loved me back as more than an ATM machine. Dad. Margaret set down the letter. Victoria was openly sobbing. Douglas stared at his hands. Jeffrey couldn't lift his head. Eleanor stood slowly, movements stiff and painful. She picked up the photograph. Your father asked me to tell you one more thing. It's not too late. Not too late to be better, to do better, to live lives that mean something. She moved toward the door, then paused. He also asked me to give you these. She handed 3 envelopes to Margaret. Personal letters. One for each of you. Margaret will give them to you when you're ready. Wait. Douglas stood, voice hoarse. What will you do with the money? Eleanor smiled, sad and knowing. Your father and I discussed that. Hammond Industries will continue operating. But the profits will go toward something we both believed in. Margaret explained. The Hammond Walsh Foundation. Scholarships for underprivileged students. Affordable housing. Support for small businesses in underserved communities. Richard wanted his money to help people who never got the advantages you were born with. He wanted to make up for 1969, Eleanor added softly. He wanted to be the man he should have been. She turned to leave. Ms. Walsh, Jeffrey called out, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. We're so sorry. Eleanor paused at the door. Her eyes were bright with tears, but her voice was steady. Don't apologize to me. Live better. Be better. That's what your father wanted. That's the only apology that matters. The door closed softly behind her. 3 weeks later. In it, Richard had written about watching her graduate from Harvard. How proud he'd been. How he'd hoped she'd use her brilliant mind to make the world better. About the little girl who used to bring him drawings and demand he hang them in his office. When did my daughter, who wanted to save whales, become someone who only wanted to be richer than her friends? She called her assistant, cleared her schedule for a month. She was going to Portland to volunteer at a homeless shelter. It was a start. Richard had bought it as a wreck and spent 3 years restoring it. Douglas had been 16, complaining about being bored, never once offering to help. His letter said, "Things worth having are worth working for. It's not too late to learn." He signed up for a mechanics class at community college. The other students were half his age. He didn't care. His letter was the longest, page after page of stories Jeffrey had never heard. About the hardware store that almost failed. About loans Richard couldn't pay back. About nights of fear and doubt. Success isn't the absence of failure. It's what you do after you fail that defines you. I failed Eleanor. I failed at being the man I should have been. But I kept trying. That's all anyone can do, son. Keep trying. Jeffrey cried for the first time since childhood. Then he went home and enrolled in the community college entrepreneurship program. 6 months later, Eleanor stood at the ribbon cutting. Kids getting tutoring. Adults learning job skills. Families accessing resources they'd never had. The Hammond siblings were all there. Victoria had donated an additional $500,000 from her own accounts. Douglas was teaching financial literacy classes. Jeffrey had set up a small business incubator. They weren't close yet. Maybe they'd never be. Too much damage, too many years. But they were trying. Eleanor looked at the 3 of them, Richard's children, finally becoming the people he'd hoped they'd be. And for the first time in 50 years, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Hope. Because Richard Hammond had been wrong about one thing. It's never too late to become the person you should have been. It's never too late to choose love over fear, generosity over greed, meaning over money. Sometimes it just takes a shock to wake us up. Sometimes it takes an old woman with a worn leather purse and a faded photograph to remind us what really matters. The chandelier in that conference room still casts the same harsh shadows. But the people who once sat beneath it, mocking an old woman they didn't know, have been forever changed. Not by money, not by inheritance, but by the truth. And sometimes that's the most valuable thing we can leave behind. If the story moved you, hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe for more incredible stories that will make you think, feel, and see the world differently. Drop a comment. What would you have done in Richard's position? Would you have fought for love or chosen your dream? I'll see you in the next one.